In 1650, 7 odd first aid techniques were used in an attempt to revive Anne Green, a young girl who had been convicted of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. After the execution, 2 physicians were supposed to dissect her, but when opening her casket, they found that she was still faintly breathing. In an attempt to save her, they used first aid consisting of rubbing her arms and legs, tickling her throat with a feather, tapping blood from her, applying mustard plasters, giving her a healing potion, as well as blowing tobacco smoke up her back end. They then placed her in bed with another woman, and soon after she made a full recovery. I imagine you likely have some questions. First of all, the story of Anne Green is real, and they did in fact use all of these weird first aids, if you can even call them that. I mean, how did they even come up with some of this stuff? Like, what the hell is anal smoking, and where can I book a time? How did Anne even survive being hanged? And is there really any truth behind these ridiculous first aid techniques? Well, you're just about to find that out. This is not just a piece of cloth. It represents one of the basics of first aid that has been used to save countless lives throughout history. It's known as a tourniquet, and when tightened around a limb, it can be used to control bleeding, both when a person is injured and for amputations. But that wasn't how it was initially used. The first mention of a tourniquet is from Hindu medical texts from the 6th century BC, describing them as being used for snake bites. They were doing this to stop the venom from spreading, but without one antivenom, it likely did more harm than good. 300 years later through war, the Greeks would bring the tourniquet from India to the West. But they never ended up reliably using it to stop blood loss either, and the reason why is quite interesting. It turns out that the Greeks likely never realized that severe blood loss could lead to death. Now, I know this may seem obliviously obvious to us modern humans, but to the Greeks, it didn't fit into any of their philosophical views. In his book The Healing Hand, pathologist Guido Mino writes, Greek physicians had already worked out the main principle of the tourniquet. Towards saving lives, this was a major step, or rather it should have been so, because this basic principle of first aid, the tourniquet, somehow failed to gain general acceptance, and then it was lost. And by lost, Guido really means lost. The Romans learned about the tourniquet from the Greeks, where it was ridiculed by Galen, Rome's most famous surgeon. And after 100 AD, the tourniquet just seemed to mostly vanish from our history books, not to reappear for close to 1.5 millennia, leaving countless people to bleed out instead of being saved because people refused to use this simple form of first aid. While we wait for the tourniquet to reappear, let's go through some of the details about the trial of Anne Green. The murder she was charged for was of her own newborn child, which came as a surprise to most, as she worked for the wealthy family of Sir Thomas Reed, and didn't really seem to have any reason to tend to violence. There were talks about the child being dead on arrival, but this was rejected due to the fact that Anne had purposefully hidden the child, clearly indicating ulterior motives. And by the opinion of the prosecutor and many others, the verdict was clear. She was guilty and deserved to be hanged. How she survived is still a mystery. This is the only surviving depiction of the events, showing Anne being hanged, the casket she was put in, and her recovering in bed. She was supposedly hung for a full 30 minutes, and it's even documented that some of Anne's friends, by her own request, were hitting her chest and pulling her legs down with their entire weight to make the suffering end sooner. But somehow she survived. A first aid technique that definitely did not help in reviving Anne was the action of draining blood from her. Known as bloodletting, this is one of the more famous and outdated first aid techniques. To tease out its origin, we'll have to revisit the Greeks. While they were not the first to apply bloodletting, the Egyptians most likely had them beat out by at least a millennia. They did formulate a more detailed theory as for why. Humorism, the theory of the 4 humors, referring to liquids in the body. More specifically, the Greeks wrote that the human body contains blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These are the things that make up its constitution and cause its pains and health. Did you become ill? Well, that was due to an imbalance of the humors that was best remedied by removing the excess, by bleeding you. Galen only strengthened this association, believing that blood was a dominant humor. And this idea, it spread like wildfire. While this tantra would not truly end before well into the 19th century, the tourniquet was able to make a comeback before that, in the early 1500s, where it was finally beginning to see some consistent use in amputations. Just give me a second. In 1593, a slight redesign of the original would appear, consisting of inserting and twisting a rod, making it relatively easy to completely stop bleeding. This easy compression would become a staple in tourniquet design, which saw many developments over the following centuries, including in 1718, when the French surgeon Jean-Louis Petit invented this version with a screw, and in the process coined the word tourniquet, from the French word tourner, meaning to turn, finally giving the first aid tool its modern name. By the end of the 1700s, the designs were still quite complex. And while the Petit screw tourniquet was still being used by the US Civil War, the simpler field strap tourniquet was more popular. And eventually, we've actually mostly returned to the simplicity of using a version with a stick. And much like the tourniquet design had been simplified, so had the circumstances surrounding Anne's sentencing, because the prosecutor had gotten it completely wrong. This is what really happened behind the scenes. At 17 weeks pregnant, Anne would give birth to a premature stillborn boy. Embarrassed, she chose to hide the child, but it was found out and she was prosecuted. Keep in mind that at 17 weeks, the fetus was probably about 12 to 15 centimeters long, only a little bigger than the size of a grapefruit when curled up, not anywhere close to being fully developed. But it didn't matter. She was deemed guilty of murder and hanged shortly thereafter. Perhaps there were a hidden motive behind all of this. I mean, the allegations were clearly false. How could the court just ignore that? It sounds almost as bogus as thinking that drinking radioactive water will cure all your ailments. You know, just a random thought. With the discovery and isolation of the radioactive element radium in 1898 and 1911 respectively by the famed Marie and Pierre Curie, it would begin to gradually make its way into beauty products, such as creams and powders, for the glow it supposedly provided. And it was eventually mixed with water and straight up sold as a medicine. I probably don't have to tell you why this was a terrible idea, but back then the dangers of radiation were not fully realized. Even Curie herself would eventually succumb to its effects in 1934, after her many exposures over the years. Luckily, the consequences of radium were limited by its hefty price, for some time literally being the most valuable substance in the entire world, at $120,000 per gram, nearly 3 million in today's money. It was only really the radium water that contained enough to be severely damaging over time, which was best illustrated by Eben Byers, a wealthy American who consumed it daily for years. I won't show you what slowly happened to his face, as it's simply too graphic, but I can tell you that he ended up not having a jaw anymore. Something good did come out of his death though, as it drew much public attention, finally ending the era of radioactive medicine. Luckily for Anne, they didn't have radium in her time, but as part of their first aid, the two physicians did make her drink another substance, cordial. These were mixtures of alcohol with various herbs, spices, and even gold flakes in some cases. They were probably first made in Europe during the Renaissance and had become very popular as a cure-all medicine by the time it was given to Anne. In reality, cordials probably didn't do much good as a first aid tool, but weren't significantly harmful either. By the 18th century, people were beginning to mainly consume them as just another alcoholic drink, and eventually they turned into what we today know as liqueur. So all in all, not too bad, at least compared to the various radium medications and many other concoctions that were being sold at the same time. But there were also some remedies that may have actually worked. A great example came from Chinese railroad workers from the mid to late 1800s. They brought with them many traditions, including a medicine made from the fat of the Chinese water snake. It was marketed for its anti-inflammatory properties, especially on joint pain. While this may sound a bit dodgy, water snake was high in the omega-3 EPA, which could realistically reduce inflammation. Regardless, it quickly became very popular in the US, but unfortunately there was only so much water snake to go around. So many salesmen began selling fake versions of the water snake oil, made from cheap beef fats and vegetable oil that didn't have any medicinal properties. In fact, this problem ended up becoming so widespread and problematic that it has given rise to the popular phrase snake oil as we know it today, referring to any product or service that is marketed with exaggerated or fake claims of effectiveness. The cordial Anne was fed was indeed snake oil of the modern kind, and we're about to meet another snake in wrapping up the story of Anne Green. And I haven't been entirely honest with you up until now, because I've left out an important detail: the identity of the prosecutor, Sir Thomas Reed, Anne's employer. While his intentions remain uncertain, they may have been connected to the possible father of the child, the identity of which he may have sought to keep hidden, with it being suspected of either being a result of his young grandson seducing Anne, or perhaps a more sensitive person connected to Sir Thomas. And initially, it seemed he had succeeded, but Anne had cheated death, so what was to happen? Well, 3 days after Anne's execution, Sir Thomas would meet the exact same fate he had intended for her, as he passed away himself. While the cause of his death remains unclear, it is said by some historians that Reed died choking on his food when he heard of Green's recovery. With Sir Thomas gone, there was no longer any prosecution to uphold the charges, so the court declared Anne as pardoned, as the hand of God had preserved her. Justice had been served. Keep in mind that none of this would have happened if the two physicians had failed to revive Anne, and they were not entirely off with some of their first aid. Rubbing of her limbs and heat from another woman likely aided Anne in her recovery. Even the mustard plasters may actually have been helpful. These were mixtures of things like mustard powder, flour and honey that were then soaked into a cloth and placed on the skin to simply provide heat. Hypothermia, the lowering of the body's core temperature to dangerous levels, is a common risk factor from trauma. So applying heat to the affected person is actually a fully approved first aid that holds up today, although we switched to mostly using thermal blankets that were originally designed by NASA in the 1960s. But that is also where the good ends and where we need to talk about anal smoking. This is really a first aid consisting of blowing specifically tobacco smoke up your behind, and was more commonly known as a tobacco smoke enema. It's based in humorism, the theory that gave us bloodletting, where the smoke was thought to provide heat to the intestines, which supposedly was beneficial. In reality though, they were far from benign, as tobacco smoke can act as an irritant, and the pressure could possibly rupture sensitive skin and blood vessels. Some liquid enemas may even result in necrosis of parts of the rectum. Despite this, enemas themselves actually have a quite rich history, having been used consistently for millennia. Even today, they are essential in some medical specialties, like dealing with constipation in the elderly and terminally ill patients. Not the tobacco smoke enema though, as it's been retired for a while. It was most known for its use in the resurrection of drowning victims in the 1700s and 1800s. But that wasn't the only first aid recommended for the drowned. And this is where the techniques go completely off track, because some of the suggestions are wild. Let's start off with how to expel the water ingested by the drowned. Some would simply choose to hang them by their feet, although it was preferred to literally place the drowned in a barrel and then whirl them in different directions to expel the water. And if against all odds that didn't work, you could tickle their throat with a feather to induce vomiting. You should then stimulate their nostrils again with a feather, as well as maybe some liquor vapors, sneezing powder or tobacco. Another technique describes that you should place them in bed and then turn them in different directions. And in the most serious cases, you might need to cut open the jugular vein, one of the main blood vessels carrying away blood from the brain, as well as perform a tracheotomy, a procedure where you puncture a hole in the lower neck into the windpipe. Unsurprisingly, there's no evidence that these procedures increase the survival rate of the drowned. And I've saved the best two for last, because believe it or not, they would actually pour hot urine into the mouth of drowning victims, and even cover them in animal excrements. Now, it could certainly be easy to look back on these arguably ridiculous things people used to do in an attempt to revive the drowned and ridicule them for it. But remember that it was done out of desperation. If one of your loved ones got hurt, you would likely be willing to do anything to help them. And in a world before science had really taken its place, there would naturally be a wide selection of odd suggestions, which may have even been beneficial. In his book The Skeptical Chemist from 1661, Irish chemist Robert Boyle describes an experiment where he would administer electrical shocks to the chest of a drowned chicken in an attempt to revive it. And even though he and others failed, people were willing to try it. So much that by the 1790s, shocking people with primitive battery cells were used alongside other resurrection techniques for the drowned. And even though the primitiveness of this probably meant that it didn't work, this would eventually evolve into what we today know as defibrillators. Shaking the victim and punching their chest evolved into chest compressions, and blowing smoke and air up various openings with bellows slowly transitioned to become mouth-to-mouth resurrection. Regardless of the ridiculousness of old first aid techniques, they were the foundation that eventually led us to modern and effective first aid that saved thousands of acutely injured people all around the world every single day. So in the end, I think we made it out pretty well. Oh, and as for Anne, after fully recovering, she would travel to the country to live with some friends, taking with her the coffin she was supposed to have been buried in. Here she found a husband, got children, and lived out the rest of the life she was not supposed to have. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.